The rejection email glowed on my phone screen, its polite corporate language doing nothing to soften the blow. 4 months of unemployment had become a daily exercise in disappointment, with each morning bringing a new wave of anxiety as I checked my inbox. This particular rejection stung more than most. It had been my 3rd interview with the company, and I'd allowed myself to hope. I tossed my phone onto the small desk in my studio apartment and gazed at the stack of bills waiting to be paid. My savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and the rent was due in 2 weeks. My parents had helped last month, but their assistance came with thinly veiled disappointment. Maybe if you'd stuck with accounting instead of switching to art history, my father had suggested during our last phone call, his tone making it clear this wasn't merely a suggestion. My laptop pinged with a notification, another job alert. I almost ignored it, tired of scrolling through listings that either required years more experience than I had or offered wages that wouldn't cover half my rent. But habit made me click anyway. Live-in assistant, Blackwood Manor, immediate start, $5,000 monthly. I sat up straighter, certain I had misread the salary. $5,000 monthly for a live-in position? The listing was brief, mentioning light cleaning duties and minimal experience required, with room and board included. It seemed too good to be true, which usually meant it was. But desperation has a way of silencing skepticism. I sent my application immediately, then spent the next hour researching Blackwood Manor. The information was sparse, a historic property on the outskirts of town, owned by the Blackwood family for generations. A few old newspaper articles mentioned renovations over the years, but little about its current state or occupants. To my surprise, I received a response that same afternoon, requesting an interview the following day. The email came from a Mrs. Anderson, her message as brief and utilitarian as the job posting. The next morning, I stood before my closet, debating what to wear. I settled on my navy blue dress, professional without being flashy. I needed this job, and first impressions mattered. As I applied mascara with shaking hands, I practiced answers to potential interview questions and tried to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Blackwood Manor was further from town than I had expected, nestled at the end of a winding road lined with towering oak trees. The trees formed a canopy over the path, blocking much of the morning light. The manor itself was massive, a sprawling Victorian structure with weathered stone walls and narrow windows that looked more like watching eyes than architectural features. I parked my old Honda in the circular driveway and sat for a moment, taking in the imposing building. Something about the place made me want to drive away, but I couldn't afford to follow that instinct. I checked my makeup in the rearview mirror, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The front door was heavy oak with intricate carvings that might have been beautiful if they hadn't been so worn by time. I lifted the brass knocker and let it fall, the sound echoing ominously. For several moments, nothing happened. I was about to knock again when the door swung open. The woman who stood before me matched the manor in her severity. She wore a dark dress that hung to her ankles, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. Her eyes assessed me with clinical detachment. "Miss Sarah Collins?" Her voice was as cold as her appearance. "Yes, I'm here for the interview with Mrs. Anderson." "I am Mrs. Anderson. Please come in." I followed her into a dimly lit foyer. The interior of Blackwood Manor was as imposing as its exterior. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and antique furniture that looked too fragile to be used. The air inside felt heavy and still, as if the house rarely welcomed fresh air or visitors. Mrs. Anderson led me through a long corridor to what appeared to be a study. A man stood by the window, his back to us as we entered. He turned at our arrival, and I was struck by his appearance. While Mrs. Anderson embodied cold austerity, Mr. Brewer projected warmth that seemed at odds with the house around him. He wore a tailored suit that emphasized his tall frame, and his smile revealed perfect teeth. "Ah, Miss Collins. So pleased you could join us today." He stepped forward to shake my hand, his grip firm. His hand felt cool against mine, almost too smooth. "I'm Mr. Brewer, the estate manager for Blackwood Manor." They asked me to sit in a high-backed chair that made me feel small. The interview began with standard questions about my work history and qualifications, but quickly took an unusual turn. "Are you troubled by unusual noises at night, Miss Collins?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her expression unchanging. No. I usually sleep pretty soundly," I replied, confused by the question. "And how would you describe your adherence to rules?" Mr. Brewer asked, leaning forward slightly. "Do you consider yourself someone who follows instructions precisely?" "Yes, absolutely," I said, though I wondered what kind of cleaning job required such strict rule following. The questions continued in this vein, odd inquiries about my comfort with solitude, whether I was easily frightened, if I had any religious beliefs that might interfere with the requirements of the position. Throughout it all, Mrs. Anderson took minimal notes, while Mr. Brewer maintained his pleasant smile that never quite reached his eyes. "The position requires you to live on the premises full-time," Mrs. Anderson explained. "You would have 1 day off per week, but otherwise must remain on the grounds. Your duties would include light cleaning of the East Wing, where you would also have your quarters and occasional assistance with special projects." "Special projects?" I asked. "Nothing beyond your capabilities," Mr. Brewer assured me, his voice smooth as silk. "Primarily maintaining the integrity of the Manor's unique atmosphere." The vagueness of the job description should have been another warning sign, but the salary they confirmed, $5,000 monthly, made it easy to overlook these red flags. With that money, I could pay off my student loans faster, rebuild my savings, and finally stop disappointing my parents. "When would you need me to start?" I asked. Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Brewer exchanged a quick glance. "Immediately," Mrs. Anderson said. "Today, if possible." This should have been the biggest red flag of all. What legitimate job needed someone to start the very same day? But my desperation clouded my judgment. I thought of my nearly empty bank account, of having to ask my parents for money again, of the growing silence on our phone calls that spoke louder than words. "I would need to get my things from my apartment," I said, already calculating how quickly I could pack. "Of course," Mr. Brewer smiled. "We'll expect you back by nightfall. It's important that new staff are acclimated before dark." As Mrs. Anderson led me back through the winding corridors, I noticed details I had missed on our way in. The way certain floorboards seemed to groan under our weight, even though Mrs. Anderson stepped lightly. How some doors were secured with padlocks despite the Manor's apparent vacancy, the faint smell of something burnt beneath the polish and old wood. At the front door, Mrs. Anderson handed me a contract. "Review and sign this before you return," she said. "The terms are non-negotiable." I took the papers, noticing how thick the document was for what was supposed to be a simple housekeeping position. As Mrs. Anderson opened the door, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow passing quickly across the landing of the grand staircase. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. "Is there someone else in the house?" I asked. "The Manor is currently unoccupied except for staff," Mrs. Anderson replied, her tone making it clear she considered the question inappropriate. Outside, the sky had darkened with gathering clouds, and the wind had picked up, making the branches of the oak trees sway and creak. I hurried to my car, feeling the weight of the Manor's gaze on my back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Mrs. Anderson still stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the lighter interior, watching me leave. I should have trusted the uneasiness that settled in my stomach as I drove back to my apartment. I should have recognized that the desperation pushing me toward this job was leading me into something dangerous. But $5,000 a month meant freedom from financial worry, meant proving to my parents that I could support myself, meant no more rejection emails. By late afternoon, I had packed 2 suitcases with everything I thought I'd need. I'd signed the contract without reading it as thoroughly as I should have. Another mistake born of desperation. I'd terminated my apartment lease, telling the landlord it was my lucky day, that I'd found a job with housing included. As I drove back to Blackwood Manor with the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees, I told myself that the strange interview questions were just eccentricities of wealthy people, that the vague job description would become clearer once I started. I silenced the voice in my head that whispered warnings. The manor looked different in the fading light, more imposing, more alive somehow. This time, the door opened before I could knock. Mrs. Anderson stood there, somehow knowing exactly when I would arrive. "You've returned," she said, as if there had been some doubt. "Mr. Brewer will show you to your quarters. Your duties begin tomorrow." Mr. Brewer appeared beside her, still smiling that not-quite-right smile. He took one of my suitcases. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Miss Collins," he said. "I trust you'll find everything enlightening." I stepped across the threshold, the heavy door closing behind me with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. In that moment, I knew I had made a terrible decision, but it was too late. I had nowhere else to go, no way to turn back. I had walked willingly into the jaws of something I didn't yet understand, all because I couldn't bear the weight of one more disappointment. I stood in the foyer of Blackwood Manor, the heavy oak door closing behind me with a sound that felt too final. My suitcases sat at my feet, containing everything I owned in the world. The contract I'd hastily signed was folded in my pocket, and somewhere in town, my landlord was already planning what to do with my now vacant apartment. The weight of these facts pressed down on me as I looked up at the towering ceiling of my new home. Mr. Brewer's smile remained fixed as he picked up one of my suitcases. "This way, Miss Collins. Mrs. Anderson will show you to your quarters in the East Wing." I followed them through the dim corridors, trying to memorize the route. The manor's layout seemed intentionally confusing, with hallways that curved when they should have been straight and doorways positioned at odd angles. Ornate sconces cast weak light that barely pushed back the shadows. "The East Wing is your domain," Mrs. Anderson said, walking ahead of me. Her footsteps made no sound on the wooden floors. "You will clean only the areas I designate. Other parts of the house are not your concern." We passed several closed doors before reaching a long hallway with tall windows that looked out onto overgrown gardens. At the end of this hallway, Mrs. Anderson unlocked a door and gestured me inside. "These will be your quarters." The room was larger than my entire studio apartment had been. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, its dark wood matching the heavy furniture scattered throughout the space. A writing desk sat near windows that looked out onto dense woods beyond the property. A small fireplace took up part of another wall, already set with logs, though unlit. A door on the far side presumably led to a bathroom. "You'll find linens in the chest at the foot of the bed," Mrs. Anderson said. "There are towels in the bathroom. Now, before Mr. Brewer leaves you to settle in, we must discuss the rules." "The rules?" I asked, setting down my other suitcase. Mr. Brewer's smile widened. "Every house has its peculiarities, Miss Collins. Blackwood Manor perhaps more than most." Mrs. Anderson removed a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to me. "These are to be followed without exception." I unfolded the paper and found a typed list of rules. As I began to read, my initial confusion quickly turned to unease. Rule 1. You must be in your room with the door locked between midnight and dawn. No exceptions, I read aloud. "The manor's structure settles most actively during those hours," Mr. Brewer offered smoothly. "Old houses make such noise. We wouldn't want you to be alarmed unnecessarily." I continued reading. Rule 2. The third floor is strictly off-limits at all times. "Structural concerns," Mrs. Anderson said flatly. "The floor is unsafe." Rule 3. Never respond to anyone calling your name after dark unless you can physically see the person calling you. I looked up at them. Why would someone? "The acoustics in this house can be quite misleading," Mr. Brewer cut in. "Voices carry in unusual ways. It's easy to become disoriented if you follow sounds without visual confirmation." The rules continued, each more bizarre than the last. Never leave windows open after sunset. Don't look out the windows for more than a few seconds at night. Always keep a light on in your room while sleeping. Never remove the mirror covers in the main hallways. Don't enter the West Wing alone. If you hear scratching at your door, ignore it, no matter how persistent it becomes. These seem excessive for a cleaning position, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Blackwood Manor has stood for over 200 years, Mrs. Anderson replied. It has developed certain requirements for maintaining its peace. The house has a personality all its own, Mr. Brewer added with that same unnerving smile. These rules simply help you accommodate its quirks. I wanted to ask more questions, to demand reasonable explanations, but the $5,000 a month silenced my objections. Besides, what choice did I have? I'd already given up my apartment. I understand, I said, folding the paper and putting it in my pocket next to the contract. Excellent, Mr. Brewer said. I'll leave you to get settled. Mrs. Anderson will show you your duties in the morning. After they left, I sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at my new home. The room was clean, but had an unlived-in feel, as if it had been waiting for someone for a very long time. I unpacked my clothes and arranged my few personal items, trying to make the space feel more like mine. The bathroom was surprisingly modern, with a large clawfoot tub and separate shower. At least the plumbing had been updated, even if the rest of the house seemed frozen in time. By the time I finished unpacking, night had fully settled. I drew the heavy curtains across the windows, remembering Rule 5 about not looking out for too long after dark. I tried to laugh at myself for already following these ridiculous rules, but the sound died in my throat. Sleep came uneasily that night. Despite the room's size, it felt close and airless. I left a small lamp on as instructed, casting strange shadows across the ceiling. I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around me. Wood creaked, pipes knocked, wind whistled through some distant part of the manor. Morning brought welcome light streaming through the windows. After showering and dressing, I found Mrs. Anderson waiting for me in the hallway, as if she'd known exactly when I would emerge. Your duties are straightforward, she explained as she led me through the east wing. You will dust the furnishings, vacuum the carpets, polish the woodwork, and keep the windows clean. You will not move or rearrange any objects you find. If something appears to be broken, report it to me, but do not attempt to fix or remove it. She showed me a cleaning supply closet tucked into an alcove. Everything you need is here. You will clean the east wing drawing room today. The drawing room was a large, formal space with furniture draped in white sheets. When I removed one sheet from a sofa, dust motes swirled in the sunlight. Has no one been living here? I asked. The manor has been without a proper staff for some time, Mrs. Anderson replied. Previous assistants have been unsuitable. I wanted to ask what had happened to them, but her tone suggested the topic was closed. I spent the day cleaning as instructed. The work wasn't difficult, just tedious. Dusting shelves filled with old books, polishing ornate banisters, cleaning windows that looked out onto the neglected gardens. Throughout it all, I had the persistent feeling of being watched, though whenever I turned around, I was alone. At lunchtime, I found a tray outside my room with a sandwich, an apple, and a glass of water. The same happened at dinner. A tray with a simple meal left outside my door. I never saw who delivered them. As the day wore on, I tried to convince myself that this would be easy money. So what if the house was old and creepy? So what if the rules were strange? I just needed to follow them, do my job, and collect my paycheck. $5,000 a month to dust furniture and ignore weird noises. I could handle that. By evening, I was tired but satisfied with my work. The drawing room looked significantly better. I returned to my room early, remembering the midnight curfew. I showered again, washing away the day's dust, and settled into bed with a book I'd brought. The manor grew quieter as night deepened. I checked my phone. No service, of course. Another thing Mrs. Anderson had warned me about. The walls are too thick for reliable signals, she'd explained. though I wasn't sure I believed her. At 11:30, I double-checked that my door was locked, turned off the main lights, and left the small bedside lamp on as required. I told myself the rules were just the eccentricities of an old house and its caretakers. Nothing to worry about. I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly, unsure what had disturbed me. The room was cold, despite the blankets. My phone showed it was just after midnight. I was about to try sleeping again when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again, from just beyond my door. Sarah. My name, spoken softly but clearly. The voice was neither Mrs. Anderson's nor Mr. Brewer's. It had a quality I couldn't quite place, something wrong about its tone, as if spoken through a broken instrument. Sarah, help us. I remembered Rule 3. Never respond to anyone calling your name after dark unless you can physically see them. I pulled the blankets tighter around myself, heart pounding. We know you're awake, Sarah. The whisper came again, slightly louder, slightly closer, as if whoever or whatever was speaking had pressed its mouth against the crack of my door. Let us in, Sarah. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock. I watched, frozen, as it rotated back and forth. The wood of the door itself seemed to flex inward slightly, as if under pressure. Let us in. Let us in. What had started as a whisper grew in volume and distortion, becoming less human with each repetition. I pressed my hands over my ears but couldn't block it out. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The doorknob stilled. The silence that followed was almost worse than the whispers had been. I sat awake for the rest of the night, the bedside lamp casting weak light against the darkness. As I watched the door, waiting for the voice to return, one thought kept circling in my mind. I had made a terrible mistake. The next day passed in a haze of anxiety and exhaustion. I moved through my cleaning duties like a ghost myself, jumping at every creak and shadow. Last night's whispering voice had left me too terrified to sleep, and I'd spent the remaining hours until dawn huddled on my bed, staring at the door. Mrs. Anderson had noticed the dark circles under my eyes at breakfast, but said nothing. I worked mechanically, dusting the library shelves as instructed, my mind replaying those awful whispers. I kept wondering if I should ask Mrs. Anderson about what had happened, but something told me she wouldn't appreciate the question. Or worse, she might act like she had no idea what I was talking about. By the time I returned to my room that night, my body ached for rest. I checked the lock twice, then 3 times, before changing into my pajamas. The memory of that voice saying my name made my skin crawl. I left the bedside lamp on as required and crawled under the covers, hoping sheer exhaustion would pull me into dreamless sleep. It must have worked because the next morning I woke with my face pressed into the pillow, having slept through the night. The second day followed much the same pattern, cleaning the dining room this time, avoiding Mrs. Anderson when possible, and eating the meals left outside my door. No sign of Mr. Brewer. The house remained quiet except for its usual settling sounds, and I began to hope that perhaps the first night had been some kind of initiation test. By my 3rd night at Blackwood Manor, I'd almost convinced myself that I could handle this job. Yes, the rules were strange, and yes, something had whispered outside my door that first night, but nothing had actually harmed me. $5,000 a month still made it worthwhile. I just needed to follow the rules and ignore anything unusual. I went through my nightly routine with slightly less anxiety than before. I checked the lock, turned off the main lights, left the bedside lamp on, and settled into bed. Sleep came more easily this time. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when the crying woke me. My eyes snapped open, heart immediately racing. The sound came from the hallway, a child's sob, high-pitched and desperate. I lay perfectly still, trying to convince myself I was dreaming. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. The crying came again, louder this time, punctuated by words. "Help me. Please. Someone help." It was a child's voice, small and terrified. I remembered Rule 3, never respond to anyone calling your name after dark unless you can physically see them. But this voice wasn't calling my name specifically, and it sounded so real, so genuinely afraid. "I'm scared. Please help me." The crying grew more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding against my ribs. This couldn't be the same thing as the whispering voice from my first night. That had been threatening, unnatural. This was a child, crying out in fear. I tried to be logical. There shouldn't be any children in Blackwood Manor. Mrs. Anderson had said the house was unoccupied except for staff. But what if a child had wandered onto the property somehow? What if they were lost and scared? Please, I don't want to be alone anymore. The voice broke on the last word, dissolving into heartbreaking sobs. Something twisted in my chest. A lifetime of instinct telling me to help a crying child. I slid out of bed and approached my door, the floor cold against my bare feet. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, remembering Mrs. Anderson's stern face as she'd handed me the rules. Never leave your room between midnight and dawn. No exceptions. But what kind of person would I be if I ignored a child in distress? What if there was a perfectly normal explanation? Maybe Mrs. Anderson had family visiting. Maybe someone else worked here that I hadn't met yet. The crying continued, now accompanied by what sounded like small fists pounding on a door further down the hall. I unlocked my door and cracked it open just an inch, peering through the gap. The hallway was dimly lit by the same wall sconces that remained on all night. I didn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called softly, immediately regretting breaking another rule. The crying stopped abruptly. Then, in a small voice, "Help me. I'm scared." I opened my door wider and stepped into the hallway, clutching the doorframe for support. The air felt suddenly colder, raising goosebumps on my arms. I looked both ways down the corridor. Nothing. "Where are you?" I asked. A sob came from my right, toward the end of the hallway. I took a hesitant step in that direction, my bare feet silent on the carpet runner. "I'm coming to help you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just tell me where you are." I moved slowly down the hall, the only sound my own breathing and the occasional sob from ahead. As I approached the bend in the corridor, the temperature seemed to drop even further. My breath fogged in front of my face. "I'm here," came the small voice, just around the corner. I hesitated, every instinct suddenly screaming at me to turn back, to run to my room and lock the door. But I'd come this far. I couldn't leave a child alone and frightened. I turned the corner. A small figure stood in the middle of the hallway, its back to me. It appeared to be a child of perhaps 8 or 9, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes, short pants, a button-up shirt, and suspenders. The child's head was bowed, dark hair falling forward. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Then slowly, it began to turn. I should have run then. Something about the movement was wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a film played at the wrong speed. But I stood frozen, unable to look away. The child turned fully toward me, and I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all. Where features should have been was a decaying horror, skin gray and mottled, cheeks sunken, lips pulled back in a grimace that revealed blackened teeth. But worst of all were the eyes, or rather, where the eyes should have been. Empty sockets stared at me, bottomless pits in that ruined face. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare as this thing that had the shape of a child but was anything but human looked at me with its eyeless gaze. The ghost, because what else could it be, reached toward me with a small gray hand, its fingers elongated and wrong. "Help me," it said again, but the voice was different now, hollow and echoing, as if coming from the bottom of a well. I stumbled backward, a scream locked in my throat. My back hit the wall, the impact jolting me out of my paralysis. I turned to run, my feet slipping on the carpet. When I looked back, the hallway was empty. I ran anyway, back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I backed away until my legs hit the bed, and I collapsed onto it, pulling the covers around me as if they could offer protection. What I'd seen wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to erase the image of that decayed face with its empty sockets. But it remained burned into my mind, as real as the bedsheets twisted in my fingers. I was losing my mind. That had to be it. The stress, the isolation, the strange rules, they were making me hallucinate. Because ghosts weren't real. They couldn't be real. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew what I'd seen. The ghost child had been there, as solid and present as the door I'd locked behind me. As real as the cold air that had made my breath visible. As real as the voice that had cried for help. I stayed awake for the remainder of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. When dawn finally arrived, pale light creeping around the edges of my curtains, I was still sitting rigid on my bed, blankets clutched to my chest. In those long hours, something fundamental had changed inside me. My understanding of reality had shattered, leaving me adrift in a world where the impossible existed just outside my door, where the comforting laws of science and reason I'd always relied on meant nothing. And with this terrifying new understanding came another realization, one that made my blood run cold. The rules weren't arbitrary. They weren't the eccentric demands of a peculiar old house and its caretakers. They were instructions for survival. I didn't leave my room until well after sunrise, my eyes burning from a night without sleep. Every time I'd close them, I saw that child's face, or what remained of it, staring at me with those hollow sockets. My hands still shook as I pulled on my clothes and ran a brush through my tangled hair. The logical part of my brain tried desperately to explain what I'd seen. A hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. A waking nightmare. Anything other than the truth that kept pushing its way into my thoughts. Blackwood Manor was haunted. The rules made sense now. Don't leave your room at night. Don't answer voices calling your name. The mirror covers, the locked doors, the warnings about the West Wing. They weren't eccentric demands of wealthy homeowners. They were safeguards against whatever dwelled in these walls. I paced my room, going over my options. I could leave, just pack my bags and walk out. But where would I go? My apartment was gone, my savings nearly depleted. I'd have to call my parents, admit another failure, see that look of disappointment on their faces again. And then what? Start over from nothing? No. I needed answers first. I needed to know exactly what was happening in this house. I found Mrs. Anderson in the kitchen, methodically preparing tea. The room was surprisingly modern compared to the rest of the house, with stainless steel appliances that looked starkly out of place against the aged wooden cabinets. She looked up as I entered, her expression unchanged, as if she'd been expecting me. "You're late beginning your duties today," she said, placing a tea bag in a cup with precise movements. "I saw something last night." I stood with my arms crossed, my voice steadier than I expected. "Someone. A child." Mrs. Anderson's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "I see. No, I don't think you do." I stepped closer. I saw a child in the hallway, a child with no eyes and rotting skin. A ghost. She poured steaming water into her cup, saying nothing. "This isn't a normal house, is it?" I pressed. "All those rules aren't about old pipes or settling foundations. They're about whatever's haunting this place." Mrs. Anderson set down the kettle and finally looked at me. For the first time, I saw something other than cold efficiency in her eyes, a flicker of weariness, maybe even sympathy. "You should sit down, Miss Collins." She nodded toward a small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. This will take some time. I sat, my legs suddenly weak. Mrs. Anderson brought her tea to the table and settled across from me, her back straight, her hands folded around the cup. Blackwood Manor has stood on this land for 212 years, she began, her voice low and measured. The Blackwood family built it at the height of their fortune. 5 generations lived here, and almost none died peacefully. She took a sip of her tea before continuing. The first deaths came during construction. 3 workers fell from the roof in the same week. Some said they were pushed, though no one was ever seen near them. When Thomas Blackwood moved his family in, his youngest son drowned in the pond within the first month. His wife hanged herself from the 3rd-floor balcony shortly after. I felt cold despite the kitchen's warmth. Mrs. Anderson's face remained impassive as she recounted these horrors, as if reading from a shopping list. The second generation fared no better. The eldest daughter was found stabbed to death in the West Wing. Her father went mad with grief, killing 2 servants he blamed before shooting himself with a shotgun in the main hall. Over the years, there were more suicides, more accidents, more unexplained deaths. The final tragedy came in 1972, when Richard Blackwood killed his entire family before setting fire to the West Wing. The house was abandoned after that? I asked. For a time. The Blackwood Trust restored it in the 1990s. They attempted to open it for tours, but... She paused, searching for words. Incidents occurred. Visitors reported being touched, pushed downstairs. A guide was found with her neck broken at the bottom of the cellar steps, insisting with her dying breath that something had whispered to her. I swallowed hard. So the house is haunted. The house is... Mrs. Anderson seemed to choose her next words carefully. Inhabited by those who died here. Some are merely presences, echoes caught in a loop of their final moments. Others are more aware, more malevolent. They resent the living. They want company in their suffering. And that's why the rules exist. It wasn't a question. Yes, each rule corresponds to specific dangers. Never leaving your room at night protects you from the more aggressive spirits who roam the halls after midnight. Never answering voices unless you can see who's calling prevents you from being lured into dangerous areas. The 3rd floor is where the most violent incidents have occurred. My mind raced back to that first night, the voice at my door. Let us in. What would have happened if I'd opened that door? Why didn't you tell me any of this before I agreed to work here? My voice rose with anger. You let me walk into this blind. Mrs. Anderson's face hardened. Would you have believed me? If I'd told you this house was haunted by vengeful spirits, would you have taken the job? Of course not. Exactly. And yet, here we are, having this conversation because you've seen proof with your own eyes. Sometimes people need to discover the truth for themselves. That's insane. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping loudly on the floor. You put me in danger on purpose. You were never in real danger, Miss Collins. Your room is protected. Certain measures were taken during the renovation. Salt in the foundation, iron in the door frames, other precautions. As long as you follow the rules, you're relatively safe. Relatively safe, I repeated. And what happens when I don't want to be just relatively safe anymore? What happens when I want to leave? Mrs. Anderson set down her teacup. Your contract stipulates a minimum employment term of 6 months. My contract didn't mention ghosts. No, it didn't. But it did mention a substantial completion bonus, did it not? $20,000 upon successful completion of 6 months' service. I remembered that clause, buried in the pages of legal text I'd barely skimmed before signing. $20,000 had seemed generous then. Now I understood why. So that's it? I stay here for 6 months, surrounded by ghosts trying to kill me, and then you give me a big check and send me on my way? That's the arrangement, yes. Mrs. Anderson's voice was calm, almost soothing. And you've already survived 3 nights. Many don't make it past the first. Many? The word hit me like a slap. How many assistants have there been before me? She hesitated. 17 since I've been caretaker. And how many completed their contracts? Her silence was answer enough. This is human sacrifice, I said, my voice shaking. You're feeding people to this house. No one is being sacrificed, Miss Collins. Everyone who comes here makes their choice, just as you did. The manor needs a living presence. It helps keep the balance. Without it, the energies grow too strong, too destructive. We provide a service, maintaining this property, containing what's within it. Containing it? I laughed bitterly. If you wanted to contain it, you'd burn it to the ground. That was attempted after the last of the Blackwoods died. Mrs. Anderson's voice dropped lower. The fire wouldn't spread beyond the West Wing, and those who set it died in unexplained accidents within the month. I stared at her, trying to process everything. And Mr. Brewer, what's his role in all this? Something flickered across Mrs. Anderson's face. Discomfort, perhaps. Mr. Brewer handles recruitment. He has a certain charm that helps attract suitable candidates. You mean desperate people like me? People who need what we offer, a substantial salary, room and board, a chance to prove themselves. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. I need to think. I didn't know what I needed. You have a choice to make, Miss Collins. Mrs. Anderson remained seated, watching me with those cool eyes. You can leave today. We won't stop you. Your contract will be void, of course. No salary, no bonus. You'll walk away with nothing but the experience. Or I can stay and risk ending up like your 16 failed assistants. Or you can stay, follow the rules carefully, and leave in 6 months with $25,000. Enough to start fresh wherever you choose, with no need to explain another failure to your parents or anyone else. I froze. She'd hit my weak spot precisely. You don't know anything about my parents. I know enough. Her voice softened slightly. We all have our reasons for making difficult choices, Miss Collins. Pride, fear, necessity, sometimes all three. I turned away, looking out the small kitchen window at the overgrown gardens beyond. 6 months in this nightmare house, following bizarre rules to avoid being attacked by ghosts. It was insane. No amount of money was worth that risk. And yet, I imagined calling my parents, telling them I'd quit another job after just 3 days. I imagined the tightening around my father's mouth, the quick glance my mother would give him before saying it was fine. They understood. I imagined moving back into their house, sleeping in my childhood bedroom while I looked for work again in a market that had already rejected me countless times. Or I could stay, follow the rules, prove I could do this one thing, this impossible thing. If I stay, I said slowly, still facing the window, you have to tell me everything. No more secrets. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. That's reasonable, Mrs. Anderson agreed. Though I should warn you, knowing more doesn't always make it easier. I turned back to face her. I need to know about the child, the one I saw last night. A shadow passed across Mrs. Anderson's face. That would be Jacob, most likely, the youngest Blackwood of the 3rd generation. He fell down the main staircase in 1887, broke his neck. He's one of the more active presences. He asked for help. They all ask for help, Miss Collins. What they want isn't something we can give them. I took a deep breath, making my decision. I'll stay, but I want the rules written out more clearly. I want to know which spirits are where, what they do, how to avoid them, and I want a safe way to contact you if something happens. Mrs. Anderson nodded. I can provide that, and I'll show you a few more protective measures for your room. She stood, smoothing her dark dress. You've made a brave choice, Miss Collins. No, I said, meeting her eyes. I've made a stubborn, proud, probably stupid choice, but it's mine. She almost smiled, the closest I'd seen to genuine emotion on her face. Shall we begin your education on Blackwood Manor, then? There's much to cover. I nodded, steeling myself for whatever horrors I was about to learn. 6 months. I could survive 6 months of anything. I had to, because the alternative, admitting defeat, facing my parents' disappointment again, somehow seemed even more terrifying than the eyeless ghost child in the hallway. Over the next few days, Mrs. Anderson educated me about Blackwood Manor's troubled history. We sat in the kitchen each morning after breakfast while she explained the various spirits that haunted the house, their habits, and how to avoid them. I took careful notes, treating this like the most important class I'd ever attended. In many ways, it was a matter of life and death. Thomas Blackwood is the one you must avoid at all costs, Mrs. Anderson told me, her face more grave than usual. He was the last true master of the house, who killed his family before attempting to burn down the West Wing. He appears as a burned figure, often carrying the shotgun he used on his relatives. "What does he want?" I asked, writing his name at the top of my list with 3 stars beside it. "What they all want, company in their misery. But Thomas is different. He seems to maintain some awareness that he's dead, and he's angry about it. He actively hunts the living, not just to scare them away, but to harm them." I added that detail to my notes, my hand trembling slightly. "And Jacob, the child I saw?" "Jacob is complicated." Mrs. Anderson paused, considering her words. "He seeks help, but it's unclear if he actually wants to harm those he encounters. Still, you should avoid engaging with any spirit, regardless of how harmless they might seem." Each day after our morning lessons, I resumed my cleaning duties with a new awareness of my surroundings. Every room felt different now that I knew what had happened within these walls. The dining room wasn't just a dusty, formal space. It was where the second Mrs. Blackwood had poisoned her stepchildren's soup. The library wasn't just filled with old books, but with the lingering presence of the tutor who'd hanged himself from the second-floor balcony after being accused of inappropriate behavior with his young charge. The house felt heavier with this knowledge. Each creak and groan took on new meaning. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, dreading the approach of nightfall. For 2 nights after my conversation with Mrs. Anderson, nothing unusual happened. I followed the rules religiously, locked in my room before midnight, lamp left on while sleeping, ignoring any sounds from the hallway. I almost began to think that knowing the truth somehow offered protection, that awareness itself was a shield against the horrors lurking within these walls. On the 3rd night, the whispers began. I was reading in bed, trying to distract myself until sleep came, when I heard it. A faint, scratchy whisper coming from the wall behind my headboard. "Sarah." The sound was so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I lowered my book and held my breath, listening. "Sarah, we know you know now." The whisper seemed to travel through the plaster itself, not coming from any specific point, but somehow surrounding me. I set my book aside and moved away from the wall, heart hammering in my chest. "You can't hide from us forever." The voice wasn't just one voice, but many, layered over each other like a grotesque chorus. I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to make myself smaller. "We'll find a way in. We always do." The whispers continued for nearly an hour, sometimes fading into unintelligible murmurs, sometimes rising to clear threats. I didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, I was exhausted and on edge. I told Mrs. Anderson about the whispers at our morning meeting. She nodded as if this were perfectly normal. "They're testing your resolve," she said. "Now that you know about them, they'll try new tactics to frighten you. Don't engage, don't respond. They feed on fear and attention." That night, the whispers returned, more insistent. They called me by name, mentioned my parents, recited my home address, details they shouldn't know. I covered my ears with my pillow, but the voices seemed to penetrate any barrier. "Your mother worries about you. She cries when your father isn't looking." "Stop it," I whispered back, breaking the rule against responding. The voices laughed, a terrible sound like dry leaves scraping across stone. "She thinks you're a failure. They both do." I turned on my bedside radio to drown them out, but the static only seemed to provide another channel for their voices. Eventually, I took a shower, the running water finally muffling the sound enough that I could catch a few hours of restless sleep. Each night grew worse. The whispers would start as soon as darkness fell, growing more personal, more vicious. They described ways I could die in the house, itemizing each painful possibility in loving detail. They reminded me of past failures, digging into my insecurities with surgical precision. I began to dread returning to my room each evening. I found reasons to extend my cleaning duties, working later and later until Mrs. Anderson would appear in the doorway, reminding me of curfew. My hands shook constantly now, and dark circles deepened under my eyes. But still, I stayed. The thought of leaving with nothing, of facing my parents' disappointment again, kept me locked in this nightmare. On my 7th night since learning the truth, something changed. I was dozing fitfully despite the whispers when a shrill alarm jolted me awake. The sound was piercing, a fire alarm blaring throughout the house. I shot upright, disoriented, and panicked. The smell of smoke filled my nostrils. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing. Was the house actually on fire? I remembered what Mrs. Anderson had told me about the West Wing fire, how it had refused to spread beyond certain points. But what if this was different? I hesitated at my door, remembering the rule about staying in my room after midnight. The bedside clock read 3:22 a.m., but surely a fire constituted an emergency exception. The alarm continued its ear-splitting wail, and the smell of smoke grew stronger. I grabbed my robe, tied it hastily, and unlocked my door. The hallway was dimly lit by the night sconces, with no visible smoke or flames. But the alarm continued, and the burning smell remained strong in the air. "Mrs. Anderson?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the alarm. No answer. I moved cautiously down the hallway, looking for any sign of fire. The alarm seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, making it impossible to track. I reached the main staircase and looked down into the foyer. Nothing seemed amiss. That's when I heard it, my mother's voice, calling from the direction of the West Wing. "Sarah? Sarah, honey, are you there?" I froze. My mother couldn't be here. This was a trick, had to be a trick. "Sarah, please, I'm trapped. There's smoke everywhere." The voice was perfect, the exact pitch and tone of my mother's worried calls, the same inflection she used when I was sick as a child. But how could they know that? How could they mimic her so perfectly? "Mom?" The word escaped before I could stop it. "Sarah, help me please. I came to surprise you, but now I'm lost, and there's a fire." My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that my mother was 300 miles away in her bed. But the voice, it was so real, so terrified. And what if, by some wild chance, she had come? What if she was actually here, actually in danger? I took one hesitant step toward the West Wing, then another. "Mom, where are you exactly?" I called, moving slowly toward the source of her voice. "In here, honey. Hurry." The voice came from behind a door at the end of the hall, a door that led to the forbidden West Wing. I reached for the handle, then stopped. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Why wasn't Mrs. Anderson responding to the alarm? Why would my mother be in the sealed-off section of the house? I backed away from the door. "You're not my mother," I said firmly. The fire alarm cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. Then, from behind the door, came a low chuckle that bore no resemblance to my mother's voice. "Clever girl," the voice said, deeper now, masculine and rough as if damaged by smoke, "but not clever enough to stay in your room." I turned to run back to the safety of my bedroom, but froze when I saw a figure standing in the middle of the hallway, blocking my path. He was tall, his silhouette unnaturally black against the dim lighting. Parts of him seemed to shift and waver, like heat rising from pavement. As he took a step forward, the light caught his face, or what remained of it. The skin was charred and blistered on one side, the eye a milky white orb staring sightlessly. The other side retained enough humanity to show that he had once been handsome, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. He wore what might have been an expensive suit, now burned and tattered in places. In his hands was a shotgun, its barrel pointed at the floor for now. "Thomas Blackwood," I whispered, recognition immediate from Mrs. Anderson's descriptions. He smiled, the burned side of his face pulling grotesquely with the motion. "You know my name. Good. And I know yours, Sarah Collins. I know so much about you." He took another step closer. I backed up, but realized I was moving toward the West Wing door. I was trapped between two horrors. "What do you want?" My voice shook despite my effort to sound brave. "Company," he said simply. "This house gets so lonely, and you're so interesting, so desperate to prove yourself, so afraid of failure." He tilted his head, studying me. "Your mother's voice was the perfect lure. She calls you like that in your dreams, doesn't she? Worried, disappointed." I said nothing, my mind racing for a way out. Thomas was blocking the path back to my room, and behind me lay the West Wing, which Mrs. Anderson had warned housed even worse dangers. "Your mother isn't here, of course," Thomas continued, taking another step closer. "But she could be. Would you like that? I could arrange a family reunion. Your father, too. They could stay here with us. Forever." "Stay away from my family," I said, finding a streak of courage in my fear. Thomas laughed, the sound like wood splintering. "Or what? What will you do, little Sarah? You're powerless here. This is my house. These are my halls. You're just a visitor, a temporary amusement." He raised the shotgun slightly, not quite aiming it at me, but making its presence known. I didn't know if a ghost could fire a physical weapon, but I had no desire to find out. "Mrs. Anderson said you killed your family," I said, trying to keep him talking while I looked for escape routes. "Your wife, your children." Something flickered across his ruined face. Anger, or perhaps pain. They were going to leave, take what was mine. No one leaves Blackwood Manor without my permission. He took another step forward, close enough now that I could smell the acrid scent of burning flesh and hair. I fought the urge to gag. "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah," he said, his voice almost gentle. "Not yet. I want to play with you first, watch you unravel day by day. The others before you. They broke so easily, ran screaming into dangers far worse than me. But you're stronger, aren't you? You're going to last longer." He reached out a hand as if to touch my face. I recoiled, pressing myself against the wall. "Don't touch me," I warned, though I had no way to enforce the demand. Thomas smiled again. "I don't need to touch you to break you. Time will do that. Sleepless nights, constant fear. The whispering will continue. The alarms will sound again. Every rule you follow will fail you eventually." He lowered the shotgun and stepped to the side, leaving a narrow path back toward my room. It had to be a trap. "Go on," he said, gesturing toward safety. "Run back to your little protected space. Enjoy the illusion of security. We'll see each other again soon." I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I bolted past him, keeping as much distance as possible, feeling the cold emanating from his form as I passed. I ran down the hallway, not looking back, not stopping until I reached my room. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and pushed my desk against it for good measure. I collapsed onto my bed, shaking uncontrollably. My nightgown was soaked with sweat, my throat raw from suppressed screams. I curled into a ball, trying to process what had happened. The fire alarm had been false, a lure to get me out of my room. Thomas Blackwood had used my mother's voice against me, had threatened my family. And he'd let me go, not because he couldn't hurt me, but because he wanted to extend his game, to break me slowly. Mrs. Anderson had been right about him being the most dangerous spirit in the house. The hatred in his eyes, the casual way he'd threatened me. This wasn't a confused ghost stuck in a loop of past trauma. This was something malevolent and aware, something that enjoyed suffering. I didn't sleep for what remained of the night. When morning light finally filtered through my curtains, I was still in the same position, my body stiff and aching from being tensed for hours. I forced myself to get up, to shower and dress, going through the motions automatically. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My face was gaunt, my eyes red-rimmed and haunted. A week ago, I'd been worried about unemployment and disappointing my parents. Now, I was trapped in a house with murderous spirits, being hunted for sport by the ghost of a family-killing madman. The realization hit me with crushing clarity. The spirits weren't just haunting this house. They were actively hunting me, and they were growing more aggressive, more creative in their attacks. The whispers, the false alarm, using my mother's voice, these were calculated tactics designed to wear me down. How much worse would it get? What would Thomas Blackwood try next? And how could I possibly survive 6 months of this when I was already breaking after just 1 week? As I made my way to the kitchen for my morning meeting with Mrs. Anderson, I felt something inside me beginning to crack. The weight of fear was crushing me, changing me. I wasn't just physically exhausted. I was psychologically shattered, jumping at every sound, flinching at every shadow. 6 months had never seemed so impossibly long. I felt something within me changing as I sat across from Mrs. Anderson in the kitchen that morning. The woman sipped her tea with the same detached calmness she always displayed, even after I told her about my encounter with Thomas Blackwood. "You broke the cardinal rule," she said, setting her cup down with precision. "Never leave your room after midnight." "There was a fire alarm," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I thought the house was burning down." "There was no alarm, Miss Collins, only what he wanted you to hear." I wrapped my hands around my untouched mug of coffee, trying to stop them from shaking. He used my mother's voice. It sounded exactly like her. Mrs. Anderson nodded. "They study us, learn our weaknesses. Thomas is particularly adept at mimicry. Why did he let me go? As he told you himself, he enjoys playing with his prey." She looked at me with something almost like sympathy. "Most people who encounter Thomas Blackwood don't survive the experience. You were fortunate." Fortunate wasn't the word I would have chosen. I felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate, like Thomas had reached into my head and pulled out my deepest fears. The casual way he'd threatened my parents made my stomach turn. "I need to call my family," I said suddenly. "I need to warn them." Mrs. Anderson shook her head. "The spirits cannot leave the property, Miss Collins. Your family is in no danger unless they come here. But what if they do? What if they try to visit me or—" "I will ensure that doesn't happen." Her tone made it clear the subject was closed. "Now, after what occurred last night, I believe we should review additional protective measures for your room." She taught me to line my doorway and windows with salt, explaining that spirits couldn't cross an unbroken line of it. She gave me small pouches of herbs to place in the corners of my room and instructed me to keep a light on at all times, even during the day. "Will this stop the whispering?" I asked. "It may reduce it," she said, which wasn't the answer I wanted. That night, I prepared my room exactly as instructed. I laid salt lines, placed the herb pouches, and even drew symbols Mrs. Anderson had shown me on small pieces of paper that I tucked under my pillow. I took comfort in having some action to take, something to do besides waiting helplessly for the next attack. It didn't help. The whispers came again, more numerous and aggressive than before. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, dozens of voices overlapping until I couldn't distinguish individual words, just a constant hissing stream of malice. I turned my radio up loud enough to drown them out, but the batteries died within an hour, and the whispers immediately surged louder, as if celebrating their victory. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I stumbled through my cleaning duties like a zombie, dropping a vase that shattered across the library floor. Mrs. Anderson appeared moments later, her expression unreadable as she helped me clean up the mess. "Perhaps you should rest today," she suggested. "I can't sleep," I admitted. not with them whispering. She frowned. The protection measures should have helped. Well, they didn't. The next night was worse. The whispers continued, but now they were joined by scratching sounds that worked their way around my room, as if something with long nails was tracing the walls, looking for a way in. The sound followed a pattern, starting at my door, moving along the wall to the window, then the next wall, then back to the door, circling endlessly. When I turned the light toward any section of wall, the scratching would immediately move elsewhere. By the third night after meeting Thomas, I was barely functional. The constant noise had prevented any real sleep, and I moved through my duties in a fog of exhaustion. I found myself standing in rooms with no memory of how I'd gotten there, a dust cloth clutched in my hand, staring blankly at nothing. Mrs. Anderson watched me with growing concern, but offered no solution beyond the inadequate protections she'd already provided. Mr. Brewer remained conspicuously absent. I began to wonder if he even existed, or if he was just another ghost playing a role. On the fourth night, as I lay in bed listening to the now familiar chorus of whispers and scratching, I heard something new, a soft tapping at my window. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see, but the heavy curtains blocked any view. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle, almost hesitant, like a child's finger against the glass. I told myself not to look, to ignore it as Mrs. Anderson had instructed. But the tapping continued, growing slightly more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. After 20 minutes of the maddening sound, I couldn't stand it anymore. I slid out of bed and approached the window cautiously, standing to the side of the curtain. "Who's there?" I called, immediately regretting breaking the rule about responding. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was blessed silence. Then a small voice, a child's voice, came through the glass. "Help me. Please help me." I recognized it immediately as Jacob, the child ghost I'd encountered in the hallway, the eyeless, decaying boy who had terrified me to my core. "Go away," I said, my voice shaking. "Please," the voice pleaded. "I need to show you something important. I'm not opening this window. I'm not letting you in." "Don't need to come in," Jacob's voice replied. "You need to come out, need to see." I laughed bitterly. "Nice try, I'm not leaving this room." "Daytime," the child's voice said. "Tomorrow, daytime. Safe then." Before I could respond, the tapping resumed, softer now, more distant, as if the presence was moving away from the window. It faded completely after a few moments, replaced by the usual whispers and scratching that had become my nightly soundtrack. I returned to bed, pulling the blankets around me. Was it another trick, like the fire alarm? The rules said spirits were most dangerous at night, but they existed during the day too. Mrs. Anderson had never said they couldn't harm people in daylight, just that they were less active. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. I kept thinking about Jacob's words. Need to see. What could he possibly want to show me? And why would a ghost try to help me? Mrs. Anderson had called Jacob complicated, suggesting he wasn't entirely malevolent like Thomas, but that hardly made him trustworthy. Morning came with no resolution to my questions. I went through my duties mechanically, cleaning a small sitting room that hadn't been used in years. The thick layer of dust made me cough repeatedly, but I welcomed the physical distraction. As I worked, I became aware of a presence in the doorway. I turned, expecting Mrs. Anderson, but instead found myself looking at Jacob. In daylight, he wasn't quite as terrifying, the decay less pronounced, the empty eye sockets not as noticeable. He still looked like a dead child, but somehow more solid, more real than he had in the darkened hallway. I backed away, knocking over a small table in my haste. "What do you want?" I demanded, holding my dust cloth in front of me as if it could provide any protection. Jacob didn't approach. He stood in the doorway, his small hands hanging at his sides. "Need to show you," he said, his voice the same as it had been through my window. "Important." Show me what? He didn't answer, just turned and pointed down the hallway. I'm not following you, I said firmly. Jacob remained in the doorway, pointing. When I made no move to follow, he stepped back into the hall, then returned to the doorway, repeating the gesture, like a child trying to lead a reluctant adult to something they've found. I weighed my options. It was daylight, which offered some protection according to Mrs. Anderson. I'd already encountered Jacob once and survived, and the truth was I needed information, anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with in this house. Fine, I said, setting down my cleaning supplies. But we stay in the East Wing. I'm not going anywhere near the West Wing or the third floor. Jacob nodded and moved down the hallway. I followed at a distance, ready to run back to my room at the first sign of threat. He led me through the corridor, past the main staircase, and toward a part of the East Wing I hadn't explored yet. We stopped outside a door I'd never noticed before, small and unobtrusive, tucked into an alcove at the end of a rarely used hallway. Jacob pointed at it insistently. "What's in there?" I asked. He just kept pointing. I approached cautiously and tried the handle. It was unlocked. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. The cellar? I looked back at Jacob, who nodded. I'm not going down there. Jacob's expression, what I could read of it on his decayed face, grew urgent. He pointed again, more emphatically. Why should I trust you? I asked. Not all the same, he said, his voice echoing strangely. Not all bad. The idea that some of the spirits might not be malevolent was new to me. Mrs. Anderson had warned me to avoid all of them, never suggesting that any might be helpful. Are you trying to help me? I asked. Jacob nodded. Need to see. Before tonight. The way he said tonight sent a chill through me. What happens tonight? But Jacob just pointed at the cellar door again. Against my better judgment, I started down the stairs, looking back to see if Jacob was following. He remained at the top, watching me descend. The staircase was dark, but enough light filtered in from the open door that I could see where I was going. The cellar was cold and smelled of damp earth. Unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't filled with antique furniture or decorative items. It was a functional space with stone walls and a dirt floor in some areas. Old wooden shelves lined one wall, holding dusty jars and boxes. A large furnace occupied one corner, silent and cold despite the house having heat. I didn't see anything unusual or particularly informative. There's nothing down here, I called up to Jacob. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs then, moving with that unnatural, jerky motion. He pointed to the far wall where a heavy wooden door stood closed. I approached it reluctantly. Unlike the door to the cellar, this one had several locks, thick metal bolts, and a large padlock. All of them were currently unlocked, the padlock hanging open on its hasp. What's in there? I asked, not expecting an answer. To my surprise, Jacob spoke. The others, the ones he keeps. A chill ran through me. Thomas. Thomas keeps other spirits locked up? Jacob nodded. Ones that help. I looked back at the door, now understanding its significance. If Thomas was keeping certain spirits contained, they must be a threat to him in some way. Perhaps allies who could help me. I reached for the door handle, then hesitated. Opening it might release something dangerous, regardless of Jacob's assurances. Are you sure about this? I asked. Jacob moved closer, his presence making the air around me noticeably colder. Need to see, he repeated. Need to understand. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. Beyond was a smaller room with no windows, illuminated only by the faint light spilling in from the main cellar. As my eyes adjusted, I saw movement, shifting, translucent forms huddled against the walls. There were perhaps 5 or 6 distinct shapes, though they were difficult to count as they seemed to merge and separate in the darkness. One figure moved forward, a woman in what looked like a maid's uniform from decades past. Her form was more solid than the others, with distinguishable features despite the translucence of her ghostly state. Unlike Jacob, she showed no signs of violent death or decay. "You can see us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to form words. "He locked us away," she continued. "Those of us who tried to help the others. Those of us who resist." "Thomas Blackwood?" I asked. The ghost nodded. "He grows stronger every year, feeding on fear, on suffering. He wants to break free of the Manor's boundaries, to reach beyond these walls." This contradicted what Mrs. Anderson had told me about the spirits being confined to the property. "How?" "Mrs. Anderson said the spirits can't leave." "Most can't," the ghost agreed. "But Thomas is different. He's found a way to gather power, to consume the energy of other spirits, and he's close to breaking the binding that holds him here." Another ghost moved forward, an older man in what might have been gardener's clothes. "He needs one more death," he said, his voice like gravel. "One more sacrifice to complete the ritual." I felt cold that had nothing to do with the cellar or the presence of ghosts. "Me." The maid nodded. "You were chosen carefully. Your desperation, your pride, they made you perfect. Vulnerable yet strong enough to last until he was ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "The equinox," the gardener said, "when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. Tomorrow night." I backed away from the door. No, this can't be happening. Mrs. Anderson wouldn't." "She doesn't know," the maid interrupted. "She believes she's containing the evil here, following the rules laid down by the Blackwood Trust. But Thomas has been manipulating events for decades, positioning himself for this moment." My mind raced with questions. But why me? Why now? "Your blood," Jacob said from behind me, making me jump. I'd almost forgotten he was there. "Your connection." "What connection? I've never been here before, never heard of Blackwood Manor until the job posting." The ghosts exchanged looks that I couldn't interpret. Finally, the maid spoke again. "You carry Blackwood blood, distant though it may be, a perfect vessel for his purpose." This revelation hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, bumping into Jacob's cold form. "That's not possible. My family has no connection to the Blackwoods." "He found you," Jacob said simply. "Called you here. The job posting, the impossibly high salary, the immediate interview response. It had all been a setup, a careful trap not just for any desperate person, but specifically for me." Before I could ask more questions, a terrible scream tore through the cellar, raw and agonized, coming from one of the shadowy forms at the back of the room. The ghost writhed in apparent pain, its form stretching and thinning like smoke being pulled through a crack. "He knows," the maid said urgently. "He's found us. You need to leave. Now." The screaming ghost began to disintegrate before my eyes, particles of its essence floating upward and vanishing through the ceiling. Another ghost started screaming, then another, each being torn apart by some invisible force. "Run!" Jacob grabbed my wrist with his cold, small hand and pulled me toward the stairs. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted up the cellar steps with Jacob right behind me. As I reached the main floor, a thunderous boom shook the house, and the cellar door slammed shut with such force that the frame cracked. Jacob pushed me forward. "Your room, now." I ran through the hallways, not looking back. The house seemed to come alive around me, pictures rattling on walls, light fixtures swinging wildly, doors opening and slamming shut on their own. The temperature dropped so rapidly that my breath clouded in front of me. I reached my room and slammed the door behind me, fumbling with the lock. Once it was secured, I backed away, watching in horror as the door began to bulge inward, as if something massive was pressing against it. "Get out!" Jacob's voice came from behind me, making me whirl around. He stood by my window, his form flickering like a bad TV signal. "Tonight, Must leave tonight." "How?" I asked, my voice breaking. "They'll never let me go. Thomas will—" "Find the way," Jacob insisted before fading from view. The pressure on my door ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The house fell eerily silent, as if holding its breath. I sank onto my bed, trying to process everything I'd just learned. I had Blackwood blood. I'd been specifically chosen for whatever ritual Thomas had planned for the equinox, tomorrow night. And according to the spirits in the cellar, Mrs. Anderson didn't know the full truth about what was happening here. The realization that I needed to escape hit me with absolute clarity. Pride, financial security, my parents' approval, none of it mattered anymore. This was about survival. The $25,000 meant nothing if I wasn't alive to spend it. I spent the rest of the day in my room, door locked, planning my escape. The contract I'd signed was meaningless compared to the threat I faced. I didn't care about legal consequences or financial penalties. I just needed to get out of Blackwood Manor before the equinox. My plan took shape slowly. I'd leave after dinner, but before the midnight lockdown, that narrow window when I could still move freely through the house, but Mrs. Anderson might be occupied elsewhere. I'd take only what I could carry in one bag: clothes, my wallet, my phone, even though it had no service. Everything else was replaceable. The main obstacle would be Mrs. Anderson. I didn't know if she'd try to stop me physically, but I couldn't risk a confrontation. I needed a distraction, something to keep her occupied while I slipped away. As afternoon turned to evening, I felt a change in the house, a building pressure, like the air before a thunderstorm. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Objects on my dresser vibrated slightly, inching across the surface. The temperature in my room dropped steadily despite the heating system running. They knew. Somehow, they sensed my intentions. Dinner arrived as usual, a tray outside my door with a simple meal of chicken, potatoes, and green beans. I hadn't seen Mrs. Anderson all day, which was unusual. Part of me wondered if she too had fallen victim to whatever force had destroyed the ghosts in the cellar. I ate mechanically, knowing I needed strength for what was to come. As I finished, a soft scratching started at my window, gentle at first, then more insistent. I approached cautiously and pulled back the curtain an inch. Thomas Blackwood's burned face stared back at me, lips pulled back in a grotesque smile. Behind him floated several other spirits, vague, shifting forms with hollow eyes and reaching hands. Thomas pressed his palm against the glass, leaving a blackened eye huddled in the center of my bed. Salt circles scattered around me, watching as the cracks in my walls widened with each passing minute. The Manor's wooden bones creaked and groaned under the mounting supernatural pressure. Whatever ritual Thomas had planned for the equinox, its energy was already building, saturating the very structure around me. The clock read 11:38 p.m. Only minutes remained until midnight. The whispers that had tormented me for days grew louder, transforming from unintelligible murmurs to a chorus of distinct voices layered atop one another. They called my name, promised pain, described in loving detail exactly what would happen during the ritual. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voices bypassed my physical defenses, worming directly into my mind. "It's almost time, Sarah." Thomas's voice rose above the others, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Can you feel it? The barrier weakening? The old magic awakening?" I said nothing, clutching the iron key Mrs. Anderson had given me. It was warm against my palm, almost uncomfortably so, as if it absorbed the supernatural energy filling the room. The temperature plummeted until my breath clouded before me. The lamp, my only source of light, flickered weakly, its glow barely penetrating the unnatural darkness gathering in the corners. A sound like shattering glass echoed through the manor, followed by a concussive wave that rattled the furniture and disturbed my salt circles. The protective barriers I'd laid were breaking down. The first crack appeared in my door, not from the hinges or handle, but straight down the middle, splintering the wood as if struck by an invisible axe. Another blow landed, widening the crack, sending wooden splinters flying across the room. I scrambled back against the headboard, clutching the key so tightly it cut into my palm. The door shuddered under a third impact, then exploded inward, fragments of wood spraying across the room like shrapnel. Thomas Blackwood stood in the doorway, more solid than I'd ever seen him. The ghostly flames of his burning death outlined his tall figure, illuminating his half-charred face with an unholy light. Behind him stretched a mass of writhing spirits, some clearly defined, others merely suggestions of human forms lost in a churning fog of supernatural energy. "No more barriers," Thomas said, his ruined mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. "No more rules. No more waiting." He stepped into the room, the floorboards charring beneath his feet. The other spirits remained at the threshold, a seething wall of malevolence held back by his command alone. "The equinox arrives," he continued, approaching my bed, "and with it, your purpose." I looked desperately for an escape route, but Thomas blocked the only exit. The metal shutters on my windows remained firmly sealed. I was trapped. "Stay back," I warned, holding up the key as if it were a weapon. Thomas laughed, the sound like crackling flames. "What do you think that will do? It's just a key, Sarah, a piece of iron shaped by human hands." He reached for me, his burned hand extending impossibly, stretching across the distance between us. I could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the horrific stench of charred flesh and old smoke. Just as his fingers were about to close around my wrist, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lamp and plunging us into darkness. Something small darted between us, a child-sized figure moving with jerky, unnatural speed. "Jacob," Thomas growled, recoiling. "You dare interfere?" The child ghost stood between us, his back to me. In the darkness, his form glowed with a faint blue light, revealing his small shoulders squared in defiance. "Leave her." Jacob's voice was stronger than I'd heard before, less like the plaintive cry of a lost child and more like a command. "Not yours." "Everything in this house is mine," Thomas roared, his form expanding, flames leaping higher around him. "Including you, boy. You forget your place." "Remember mine," Jacob replied. "Remember what you did." The temperature dropped further as the two spirits faced each other. I felt the bed freeze beneath me, frost spreading across the blankets. Thomas lunged forward, hands outstretched toward Jacob. The child ghost held his ground, raising his small hands. When they connected, a blast of energy threw me against the headboard. The walls shook, plaster raining down from the ceiling. Jacob turned to me, his eyeless face somehow conveying urgency. "Run now. Use the key. East door." I didn't hesitate. I slid off the bed and darted toward the shattered doorway, ducking under Thomas's reaching arm. The spirits in the hall parted as I approached, not in retreat but in confusion, as Thomas's control over them momentarily wavered. "Stop her." Thomas's voice shook the manor to its foundations. I ran blindly down the hall, the key clutched in my hand. Jacob's instructions, my only guide. The east door, it had to be the same one Mrs. Anderson had mentioned, the path to the east gate. Behind me, a battle raged. Blue light flashed against the walls as Jacob fought to hold Thomas back. Screams, both the child's and the former master's, echoed through the corridors, accompanied by sounds like thunder and breaking glass. The manor itself seemed to wake fully, responding to Thomas's rage. The floor buckled beneath my feet, boards springing up to trip me. Light fixtures tore loose from the ceiling, crashing down just steps behind me. Doors slammed shut as I approached them, forcing me to change course repeatedly. The spirits rallied, regaining their purpose as Thomas's control reasserted itself. They swarmed the hallways, translucent forms moving through walls and floors to cut me off. Their whispers became screams, their hands reaching to grab, to tear, to stop me by any means. I rounded a corner and came face to face with Mr. Brewer, his human disguise slipping to reveal something ancient and monstrous beneath. His too-perfect smile stretched impossibly wide as he stepped toward me. "The ceremony awaits, Miss Collins," he said, his voice pleasant despite his grotesque appearance. I backed away, looking for another route. Mr. Brewer advanced slowly, confidently, knowing I had nowhere to go. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," he continued. "Thomas is already displeased with you. Further resistance will only make your part in the ritual more painful." As he reached for me, a cold presence materialized beside me. Not Jacob this time, but a woman in a maid's uniform, one of the spirits from the cellar. "This way," she whispered, indicating a narrow servant's passage hidden behind a panel in the wall. "Quickly!" Mr. Brewer's eyes widened. "You!" He lunged forward, but the maid's spirit pushed me through the passage, then turned to face him, her form expanding to block the entrance. "Run, Miss Collins," she cried as Brewer's inhuman hands closed around her spectral form. "To the east door!" I ran down the narrow passage, guided by the soft blue glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Behind me, I heard the maid's wail as Mr. Brewer destroyed her. Not a death, since she was already dead, but something worse, a second ending that erased her completely from existence. The passage twisted and turned, leading deeper into the manor than I'd ever been. The walls here were older, the wood darkened with age. Symbols had been carved into the frames, similar to those I'd seen in the Blackwood archives, protective wards, containment spells, markers of the manor's true purpose. I emerged into a small antechamber with 3 doors. One hung open, revealing the modern kitchen where Mrs. Anderson and I had spent our mornings. The second was sealed with heavy chains and padlocks, the entrance to the west wing, I realized. The third, directly across from my hiding place, was made of dark iron bound in wood, unmarked but unmistakably different from any other door in the house. The east door, it had to be. I approached it cautiously, the iron key heating up in my hand until it was almost too painful to hold. The lock was ancient, the keyhole large and oddly shaped. As I raised the key, the door shuddered, as if something on the other side were throwing itself against the barrier. A crash from the kitchen told me my pursuers had found my trail. I had seconds at most. I jammed the key into the lock and turned it with all my strength. The mechanism fought me, resisting with inhuman force. Sweat broke out on my forehead as I struggled against it, my arms shaking with the effort. "Sarah Collins!" Thomas's voice boomed through the antechamber. "You cannot escape what you are." I glanced back to see him standing in the kitchen doorway, his burned form towering nearly to the ceiling. The other spirits crowded behind him, a writhing mass of malevolence. Mr. Brewer stood at his side, his human disguise completely gone now, revealing something insectile and ancient beneath. "The ritual requires blood," Thomas continued, advancing slowly. "Your blood, freely given or forcefully taken. The choice is yours." The key finally turned, the lock releasing with a sound like a dying breath. The door swung inward, revealing not the outside world, but a long, narrow corridor lit by the same spectral blue light that had guided me through the servants' passage. I hesitated. This wasn't an exit. It was another part of the manor, perhaps another trap. As if sensing my doubt, Thomas laughed. "There is no escape, Sarah. Every door leads back to me. Every path circles back to this house. You are bound to Blackwood Manor by blood and destiny." He extended his hand, no longer threatening but offering, almost gentle in its approach. "Come willingly. Complete the ritual. I can make it painless." For a moment, I wavered. The exhaustion of days without proper sleep, the terror of being hunted through the night, the knowledge that even if I escaped, I had nowhere to go. It all pressed down on me, weakening my resolve. Perhaps surrender was easier. Perhaps fighting was pointless. "Don't listen," the small voice came from behind Thomas. Jacob materialized in the center of the kitchen, his form flickering weakly, damaged from his confrontation with Thomas. "The east path leads out," he said, his voice fading in and out like a bad radio signal. Through the old foundations, one-way journey. Thomas whirled on the child ghost, rage contorting his features. You, I should have destroyed you decades ago. He lunged for Jacob, ghostly flames leaping from his hands. Jacob dodged, moving with that unnatural, jerky speed. Run, Sarah. I'll hold them. I didn't wait to see more. I plunged through the iron door into the blue-lit corridor, pulling it shut behind me. No lock existed on this side, but I heard Jacob slam something heavy against the other side, temporarily barricading the door. The corridor stretched before me, descending gradually into the earth. The walls were no longer wood, but rough stone, carved with more of the strange symbols I'd seen throughout the manor. The air was cold, but fresh, carrying a hint of pine and night air, the outside world, somewhere ahead. I hurried forward, guided by the blue light that seemed to emanate from the symbols themselves. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing until I had to turn sideways to squeeze through, other times opening into small chambers filled with peculiar arrangements of stones or ancient, rotted furniture. Behind me, I heard the iron door finally give way, crashing open under supernatural force. Thomas's rage echoed down the passage, the stone walls amplifying his roar into something beyond human comprehension. The blue light flickered as his power reached for me, trying to extinguish my path. I ran faster, stumbling over uneven ground, scraping my hands and knees when I fell, but immediately pushing back to my feet. The passage continued to descend, the air growing colder, damper. Water trickled down the walls in places, forming small pools on the stone floor. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, not just Thomas now, but all of them. The entire supernatural force of Blackwood Manor bearing down on me. The walls shook with their approach, dust and small stones raining down from the ceiling. The passage ended abruptly at another iron door, smaller than the first, its surface covered in rust and corrosion. No handle or lock was visible, just a small indentation in the center, roughly key-shaped. I pressed the iron key into the indentation. It sank in easily, as if the door had been waiting for precisely this moment. The key grew hotter, painfully so, and I snatched my hand away as it began to glow with the same blue light that illuminated the passage. The door shuddered, then began to dissolve, not opening, but disintegrating from the center outward, the ancient iron crumbling to dust that scattered in a sudden breeze. Beyond lay the night, stars visible through the trees, fresh air rushing in to replace the stale atmosphere of the underground passage. I stepped through without hesitation, emerging into a small clearing in the woods far from the manor house. The key remained embedded in what was left of the door, now nothing more than a rusty frame attached to a stone arch that seemed to rise directly from the forest floor, with no building attached. I turned to look back through this impossible doorway and saw the passage transforming behind me. The blue light guttered and failed as the stone walls collapsed, sealing the tunnel permanently. The last thing I saw before the passage was completely blocked was Jacob's small form, standing at the far end, his eyeless face turned toward me. He raised a hand in farewell, then vanished as the final stones fell. The doorframe crumbled completely, leaving nothing but a pile of rust and stone in the forest clearing, no evidence that it had ever connected to an underground passage or a haunted manor. I was free. Dawn was breaking in the east, pink light filtering through the trees. I had no idea where I was, how far I had traveled through that impossible passage, or what direction would lead to civilization. But I was alive, and I was free of Blackwood Manor. I chose a direction and began walking, each step taking me farther from the nightmare I'd survived. My body ached from injuries both old and new. My mind reeled with everything I'd seen and learned. But with each breath of the clean morning air, I felt more like myself again. The forest gradually thinned, giving way to fields and eventually a rural highway. A pickup truck stopped when I flagged it down, the elderly driver concerned by my appearance, clothes torn and dirty, hair wild, eyes hollow from exhaustion and terror. "You okay, miss?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Look like you've been through hell." "Something like that," I replied, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Can you take me to the nearest town? I need to call my parents." As we drove away, I looked back once, half expecting to see Blackwood Manor looming on the horizon. But there was nothing, just trees and fields bathed in early morning light. The manor was gone from my sight, but not from my mind. I knew it still stood, nursing its rage at my escape. Thomas Blackwood still waited within its walls, planning, scheming, searching for another victim with Blackwood blood. Jacob and the other rebellious spirits had bought me time, but they hadn't destroyed the evil at the heart of the house. The elderly driver chatted about local news and weather, blissfully unaware of the supernatural horror just miles from his daily route. I made appropriate responses, but my thoughts remained with what I'd left behind and what I'd brought with me. I was changed. The woman who had been desperate for any job, who had signed a contract without reading it fully, who had ignored warning signs out of pride and fear of disappointing her parents. That woman had died in Blackwood Manor. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had faced unimaginable horrors and survived. I called my parents from a small-town police station. I told them I was safe but needed help getting home. I didn't explain what had happened, couldn't explain it in any way they would believe. But when my father answered, the relief in his voice told me something important. They had never been disappointed in me, only worried. My unemployment, my struggles, these had never diminished their love. The pride that had driven me to take the job at Blackwood Manor seemed so foolish now. I had nearly died trying to prove my worth, when all along I had been valued simply for who I was. As I waited for my parents to make the long drive to collect me, I sat in the police station's break room, sipping bitter coffee and watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Normal life continued around me, officers filing reports, phones ringing, people coming and going with ordinary problems and ordinary complaints. I envied them their normality, their ignorance of what existed just beyond the veil of the everyday world. But I also pitied them. They would never know how precious this ordinary life was, how easily it could be snatched away by forces they couldn't comprehend. The young woman who had entered Blackwood Manor seeking employment had been consumed by fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of an uncertain future. The woman who escaped had learned that true fear was something else entirely. And having faced it, having survived it, I found myself strangely free. I didn't know what came next. I had no job, no apartment, no plan beyond reaching the safety of my parents' home. But I was alive. I had survived. And sometimes that was enough. Outside, the day brightened into full morning, ordinary and beautiful. Somewhere behind me, hidden among ancient trees and forgotten roads, Blackwood Manor waited in silence, its windows dark, its spirits temporarily subdued. It would wait for the next desperate soul, the next vulnerable visitor. It would offer salvation with one hand while concealing destruction in the other, and it would feed, as it had for 200 years, on fear and pain and blood. But not mine, never again mine. I had escaped Blackwood Manor. The rest, rebuilding my life, finding my way forward, coming to terms with what I had experienced, would come in time. For now, I breathed the free air of a normal world and found it sweeter than anything I had ever known.